My name's Nick. I'm currently working as a senior exploration and ore body knowledge geologist for MMG at Dugald River. I've been there about 3 years, and part of my journey to get here has been quite an interesting, or quite a fun one. One of my good friends and mentors and colleague and peer, Corey Yago, who's here in the audience tonight, was the one who brought me on at Dugald, and we've had many great discussions around how challenging the geology is. And I came from, at the start of my career, working in modern seafloor massive sulfide deposits, and then slowly worked my way through to doing some more work in the Lachlan Fold belts, having a look at Ordovician, Devonian, porphyry, epithermal style deposits. Then going back to doing some more work on modern seafloor systems, and now working my way up to the Northwest Minerals province, and it gives me a headache. I find it such a challenge. It's a great challenge, but it's so complicated. And if anyone fully understands the entire system, so I'm going to really look forward to Russ's talk next month. It's quite a challenge, and one that's it keeps you up late at night, especially at site, trying to work out what's going on and figuring out the mistakes you might have made. But nonetheless, great deposit, great fun, and a great area to work in. So of course, this talk is not my own feelings, not my own thoughts, it's not my own research. It's many years, many decades, going back to the 1800s worth of work, of many years of geology work. There's contributions from our current geology team, from Corey, from Sean Neal, previous work of Brett Davis, Peter Cruz, and numerous other workers who've worked on this deposit over the last, well, let's say from first sort of discovery, around 150 years or so. So it's been it's a challenging deposit, but one that's led to some really interesting results. So firstly, for anyone who doesn't know where Dugald River is, it's up in the Northwest Minerals province. We've got, let's hope that this little laser, oh, look at that, perfect. So Dugald River sits in here in the Mary Kathleen belt. We're in the Eastern Inlier, right on the edge of the Eastern Inlier. This is a modified image from Peter Cruz's and Corey's paper in 2022. It's a great paper for anyone. I refer to it quite a lot here, and I encourage everyone to have a read of that, because it definitely poses some very significant results and poses some significant questions as well. So just bear that in mind. Obviously, numerous other deposits around the place. We've got Cannington, George Fisher, Mount Isa, Lady Loretta, Century. So a very, and this is not obviously all of the deposits. So anyone who hasn't seen how many different workings, deposits, historic mines, and other prospects, jump on to GeoRes Globe or any other GIS program and have a look, because there is quite a range. And also, before I go on, I just want to say that this is the attempt here is a little bit about the exploration history, but also a little bit about, just so that everyone gets to see it, some of the rocks and the drill core that we've actually got, because I often find with a lot of talk, sometimes there's a limited amount of rocks that actually get shown. So the attempt here is actually to show a little bit about the textures of the ore body and how that's sort of changed, a little bit of changed over time. So at the end, or even during this, if anyone's got any questions, I'm going to try and rattle through this as moderately fast as I can, but feel free to ask as we're moving along if necessary. Otherwise, we've got questions at the end. So another ex-colleague or colleague from the GSA, Pete Betts, this is a paper from his in 2006. And one thing that I like to do, especially when I'm presenting this talk or parts of this talk, especially the people who have come to Dugald and who haven't worked in the area, is show this, because this is part of the thing that gives me a headache. There's just a lot going on. So the image on the left-hand side here is part of all of the different features that have obviously occurred. And there's many people here, I'm sure, who will be able to elucidate, discuss, pull this apart far better than I can. But suffice to say, this is a very complex area of the world. It's undergone many deformation events and a lot of things over the last sort of 1.8 billion years at least. And the time-space plot here on the right-hand side, there's a little red line that you'll see up there. So that's going from around 1780 to around 1500 MA. And the reason that that's important is because that's This is my personal idea of exactly where Dugald sort of sits in the timescale. We really don't fully understand exactly the timing of the deposit. We don't understand exactly where it's actually got to. And if anyone, I'm more than happy to have this discussion with anyone if they've got any amazing bits of information, because when we look at the rocks, when we have a look at the relationships and we look at the dating that's been done, we've got the Dugald quartzite that sits down around this particular area. We've got some igneous rocks that sit in this particular area that have all got relationships to different styles of mineralization that we see at Dugald all the way through. And it's quite it means it's quite a challenge. And obviously through that, there's a great PhD that was completed in 1998 from JCU, out of JCU. And there was a suggestion that with all of the basin events, with all of the deformation events that have gone on, that there's possibly up to 6 deformation events that are observed at Dugald. This is one thing that this individual postulates, which is well, poses quite a challenge for us trying to work all that out. But nonetheless, it's a challenging, interesting place. A little bit about the geological units, and this is something that was, again, another colleague from the GSA, Ian Widnall, sort of postulated and put together back in 2008, was just where the Dugald River, the slates that host Dugald, and the other units where they sit. So within the Dugald package, we've got the Dugald quartzite, which is this big sausage-looking feature that sits off by itself without seemingly sort of stops to the north, stops to the south, and nothing much else going on. Nothing else that outcrops anywhere along strike apart from this little sausage, this little boom that you might see. Then we move on, as we're moving across into where Dugald actually sits, there are a series of metamorphosed calc-silicates. There's the slates that host the Dugald River deposit, which we'll have a little look at. They're a little bit more complicated than just a bunch of slates. And then it moves into an argillaceous limestone unit that sits in a footwall. But nonetheless, the Dugald River deposits here, and the Dugald River shale member or slate member sits there within the Mount Roseby schist, within the Mount Albert group. And this has been changed a little bit through time. There was previous interpretation that it might have been part of the Corella Formation, but Ian, in his wisdom, has suggested that no, it doesn't. So that's currently where it sits. Here's just a bit more of a zoom in of the geology. This red star is where Dugald sits. This is the Dugald quartzite, which in itself is a fairly understudied unit. There's a lot going on there, and a lot around why it is where it is, and how it's particularly got into the position it is in is one of that's not been clearly understood, and it's something that we're going to be working on.
So is that like a barrier bar, back barrier lagoon complex, or is that structurally disconnected like a sausage? How thick is this?
Oh, what a great what? Well, we'll have a look at a few little rocks in a second, and we'll try and work out. But this yes, and I apologize. This is very basic of me that I haven't put a little scale across there, but that sits at around it's about 1 kilometre or so across. Whilst we're Moreton Bay. Oh, simple. Thanks, Joan. But yeah, we'll have a little look at some of the features that we see in the quartzite there. So one of the things here, so this is sort of zooming in again. Here we've got the Dugald quartzite, and you can see the foliation that you can actually see through the quartzitic rocks themselves that are running north-south across the Dugald quartzite. Here's the current mine workings here. You can actually see as well with this nice aerial image along to the north, along strike. So the Dugald River deposit strikes pretty much north-south. And you can actually see the slates and limestone outcropping down along strike, and the deposit itself sitting in here. It's an underground working, so there's a north and south decline within this little area, and exploration is currently ongoing, which I'll talk about a little bit later, along strike of the slates here, but also interestingly on the western edge of the deposit. As we can see, we'll just go back to this other picture, is that there's slates and metamorphosed calc-silicate rocks on the western edge as well. One of the possible ideas here is that the western slates and the eastern slates are analogous. They are part of the same unit that maybe was folded, and this has been subsequently eroded, and it's the same unit. However, There was a very comprehensive honours study that was completed in 2011, I think. I might have got that wrong. Maybe it's 2012, by Kerry Lee George. And it had done some wonderful work to suggest that perhaps the slates and the calc silicates out here are not exactly analogous to the Dugald River slates. But that's something, again, that's in the works, because it's quite important. It has implications for exploration into the future. We can come to that if anyone's got any questions later on. More than happy to come to that. So here's a basic cross section that runs through the deposit that was initially produced many, many moons ago, and it's probably got a little bit more complicated now. But at the moment, we're just going to put this in through here. So on the eastern side, so we've got the deposit in the middle. We can see there the Dugald River zinc, lead, silver deposit sitting within the slates shales. Limestone sits just to the footwall. Calc silicates on the hanging wall, and then the Knapdale quartzite. And this is basically an overturned stratigraphic sequence, because younging from the quartzite through to the east is younging to the east, as far as we can understand it now. And then the sequence from the quartzite through to the west, youngs to the west. So hence where we get this idea that if these are two analogous units, that they were potentially part of some antiformal structure. On the eastern side, though, as well, just recently, a company, Harmony Copper, has just taken over the exploration leases and the location of Little Eva AIG deposit, which sits to the north of Dugald. And there's numerous copper occurrences within these eastern packages further to the east of Dugald that run north-south across the deposit. And suffice to say, even at Dugald itself, and I'll just go back to the previous image, there are also old copper workings that run on the western side of the slates. There's one there, there's one there, there's one down there. Anyway, there's a lot. And this is old workings from old workers, quite interesting areas, and something that I'll just touch on near the end. To give you a bit of an idea of the deposit itself in terms of the current, this is from 2002 mineral resource report. There's around about 60 million tonnes of ore that sort of sits at a grade of around 12%. So it's a really lovely high-grade deposit. And obviously, with the year moving on as it is, this is going to be updated at some point. There's also some copper that sits around in our hanging wall. But suffice to say, with the amount of mining that we're doing is around 1.8 to 2 million tonne a year, there's around total 30-year mine life if we take the inferred resources as what's possible. Now, one of the things that I really like is this, the mineralization style. So this has undergone a few different changes, and this may have even been something that Corey put together, I'm not sure, but I've adjusted it slightly. But the structurally controlled shear or slate-hosted epigenetic deposit, which is probably going to make some people's ears tick a little bit, but we'll go into that a little bit more. But with definite similarities to SEDEX, BHT, MVT, and skarns. So there's a lot of things that are it's an amalgamation. It's a cacophony of lots of different bits and pieces, depending on where you look in the ore body and what you actually end up seeing. But if anyone wants to go into any more detail on that, please, we can do questions at the end about that one. So one of the really interesting things about the deposit is the general sort of exploration history. And this is just a small snippet of what has actually gone on. Initial discovery of the actual Dugald River Gossan, which was originally named the lead lode, was around in the 1870s. So quite some time ago. The material that was at surface, outcropping at surface, was seen as a possible lead lode. Then Robert Jack actually visited in the 1880s and noticed an absence of, and made some notes in his diary of an absence of vegetation that was occurring at the deposit. And here we can see with this dotted and dashed line an area where the current deposit actually is, and there's a significant vegetation difference between what you see at the bottom, what you see at the top, and this middle section here. And now we're looking north of in a northerly direction, and we can see shrubs and other trees and everything else. And then there's a sudden stop of that, and then all of a sudden we come into the polyarpia zinc copper weed that actually grew across the deposit. And that's currently still used as an exploration tool to this day to just try and to look at these deposits that are outcropping at or near surface, because it picks up the the deposit quite well. So drilling commenced in around first little early bits of drilling about 1936 or so. And then there was numerous different operations here, and Russ actually just let me know that he was part of one of the drilling operations. I don't know exactly when that was, Russ, but
I was there in 1960. I think 1962.
well, there you go, 1962. So Russ was there drilling away, and numerous different exploration programs from CRA until it was acquired by MMG in 2009. In 2017 was in the start of November was when the mine officially actually opened, or when the first mining had started. So still relatively quite a young deposit generally in the area. There was a significant ore body knowledge study that was done in 2017 to try and really understand the deposit, which continued on through Peter Cruz's PhD starting in 2019 and just finishing in 2022. And a few papers, as I said, have come out of that one. The first 1 million tonne of zinc was produced in around 2020. And then in 2021, there was a significant surface growth drilling program that had started, of which Corey had spearheaded and I assisted him with. And then that drilling program's ongoing at the moment. So it's been quite a concerted effort to really understand the resource that are on the tenements that MMG had. And we've got continued ore body knowledge work going on now, and I want to talk about some of those because I personally have a really big belief in the utilisation of our government comrades, and then also those in all of the research, any sort of research capacity. There's so much that can be gleaned. There's so much information that we can share with each other, and it's something that I'm really trying to push. Here's some of the deposits, some of the copper weed itself, so you can actually see it looks like this. It's actually flowering at the moment up at Dugald. So I went for a drive just the other day around some of the old copper workings, and there's all these areas of this copper weed flowering around, which is quite nice to see. And some of the original, what the original Gossan might have looked like there in those top two images. So the early interpretations of Dugald, probably a lot of people's idea of maybe that it's a definite SEDEX, absolute SEDEX deposit itself, probably came from some of the work by Witcher in 1975. And here we've got a cross section. Here we've got the plan view. You can see the deposit outlining there. I've just superimposed the red there. And then here is a cross section, and we've got the slates and a nice smooth ore body that comes down. Everyone be happy. Maybe that's like a SEDEX. And from the early drilling that had been done, here's some of the rocks that had the majority of drilling had intersected rocks like this. Nice banded. Here we've got sphalerite, we've got a little bit of pyrite, pyrrhotite, and slates. Happy days, no problems. So that's where that originally come from. Then the drilling's continued. We've started underground mining, a lot more drilling underground, and then there's an evolution of this idea of what Dugald started to look like, and we're slowly evolving to becoming this is obviously a schematic. This is exactly not what it looks like, but we're evolving and it's changing and it's becoming much more complex, a more anastomosing style of mineralization you can see. Then as time's gone on, more surface drilling. Here we can see a little bit more of a change. And then move forward many, many years, and some of the work that Peter Cruz had done. And here's an idea of his sort of deposit scale understanding of what the structures that host the deposit are actually starting to look like. And it's a lot more complicated and complex than had originally been thought. And if you want to understand more of the detail and more of the hypothesis and the work that are done, I really encourage you to read Peter's paper. So in the deposit itself, we sort of come to understand now that it's a structurally controlled anastomosing shear system, and it has many, many features that are akin to I hope everyone here might have seen it, but some beautiful boudinage features. There's a term nexus that's used for the deposit itself, which is basically our large mineralized zones. And in those nexus zones, in the Boudin Neck, is where we find the most high grade and abundant mineralization within the breccias, which I'll show you shortly, which are found in the south zone. So this is a long section looking to the west, a north decline. There's a south decline in below that. And here is a bit of an idea of the highest grade zinc intercepts that we've got from drilling, which are off to the south. And this is interpreted as part of our Boudin Necks. In the north, the interpretation is that it's part of as the Budeneck starts to tighten up, and we have this much more vertically dipping material, which I'll show you what it actually looks like in just a moment. It's also open in all directions. So this is part of our current drilling at the moment, is that we're drilling north, south, and at depth of the deposit to understand the full extent. Here's a beautiful example. This is just a wonderful, wonderful example where we managed to actually drill directly down a beautiful Budenage vein here, so quartz carbonate vein, and in the middle, purite rimmed with a little bit of sphalerite around, just a stunning Buden. I love this picture. I keep showing it all the time. But nonetheless, we're lucky enough to drill down that. So it just gives us an idea. These are the features that we're sort of in general looking for. And here's a inclined view of the ore body. Here's the south mine. We're looking straight at a slight inclined view down. Here's the north zone, nice and thin. The south zone widens out. And if you just superimpose a little bit of core over the top that's got some Budens, we start to see these Budenage features. And we've got a quartz carbonate vein and then mineralization in through here, another quartz carbon Buden, and then mineralization in through there. It's lovely. So it's one of these classic cases of what we see at the small scale, we can start to build out and pull out to the large scale. And we try to use this as part of our understanding of the predictive nature. Whilst we don't know the periodicity of this pinching and swelling, this is part of the work that we have to do to try and understand. So here's a pretty nice image here that basically we're looking cross sections to the north and to the north. Here's the north mine, quite steeply dipping, limestone in the footwall, the slates, the calc-silicates on the western side with a little bit of igneous porphyritic material that sort of pops its way in and out as well. As you move to the south, and we can see here with all the dramatic amount of drilling that's been done, here we can actually see a widening of the ore zone and a bifurcation of the ore zone as well. So we've got the ore zone starting to pinch and swell and move apart. As we move to the south, we're chasing this to the south and seeing what's actually going on because we want to understand, we can see that continued Budenage to the south, which is part of the work that we're doing at the moment. So in terms of the rocks of what we see from the older stratigraphic unit, I'll show you another really nice bit of the quartzite. But here's the quartzite that we see that we sometimes drill through our underground drilling and surface drilling. There's the quartzite, or a part of what some of the quartzite actually looks like. Then we move through the calc-silicate units, which are variably altered. There's some beautiful folding in some of the units as you get close to the ore body. There's a porphyritic igneous unit that sits in the hanging wall, and it's not continuous. We don't see it on all the drill holes, so it's sort of pinching and swelling and making its way in and out. There's a schist unit, muscovite schist, sometimes a beautiful textbook muscovite schist, and other times it starts to, the grain size tightens up and it looks more like a bit of a phyllite. There's some altered zones that occur in the hanging wall, and that's where we mostly find the hanging wall copper material, which has been something that was chased by Oz Minerals and other workers in the past they didn't come to any sort of significant conclusions there. Then we've got the hanging wall slate, which invariably is a very fine grained slate. Sometimes these little carbonate bands that move through there with what look like relic staurolite, cordierite grains. Then there's a major shear zone, and the ore body sits in there, and we'll come to that in a moment. And then there's a footwall slate, which has porphyroblasts in through it with these little carbonate wisps, little structural carbonate wisps that are sitting in there. Often there's a strong foliation to this particular rock, but very rarely, if ever, at the moment, do we see this unit in the hanging wall, and very rarely do we see this hanging wall unit in the footwall. So it's quite controlled in through here. Then we move into the limestones. So invariably, sometimes banded with different, basically the quartz carbonate component alters through some of it. Before we get to the extreme footwall stage where we've got this argillaceous limestone with little pockets of sulfides through there. Mostly pyrrhotite pyrite. Very rarely, if ever, do we ever see any sphalerite. Just pyrrhotite and pyrite. Very important. Here's another part of the Knapdale quartzite. So this we don't see across the whole Knapdales, but beautiful ripple marks that we see in here. So there's certain units that are in there show this. Yeah. So a very good indication that at some point might have been some sort of intertidal region. Maybe it's something to do with a lot of water flow there, but we don't see that all the time. We don't see that in the whole Knapdale quartzite, which is why we're going to do a have a fairly concerted effort to really try and understand that a little bit more and understand whether it is a unit that's been popped up, maybe it's been thrust up. We're just trying to understand that because it's got some implications for exploration. The hanging wall shear, which I've called here the main shear, because we're now discovering that the hanging wall shear doesn't always sit in the hanging wall. Now that we've gone to the north and south, it's starting to change a little bit. But nonetheless, the main shear here is a carbonate or graphite, sorry, not carbonate, but a graphite-rich unit that sometimes it'll be a couple of centimeters wide. And the pinching and swelling and the anastomosing nature of this, sometimes it can be 4 or 5 drill trays wide. And the graphitic content is quite something. And it's an engineer and geotech's nightmare. So, yeah, as we're discovering, it's quite a challenge. But one that obviously, with the increased drilling that we've got a pretty good control on where it sits within the deposit. And so part of that hanging wall shear and part of that main shear is the evolution of thought that's actually gone into that, which Peter's work has really culminated in. But previous work, obviously, engineers and geotechnical engineers like straight lines because it's easier to sort of deal with. So this was something that was, part of the original structural model. But as we keep moving through there, this is another model that was produced sometime later that actually tried to really represent the geology a lot more appropriately. And so we've got this mishmash, twisted, anastomosing, pinching and swelling shear zone, which is closer to the truth than the one on the left there, but not necessarily practical from a mining point of view. So we're trying to make a bit of a balance with that. And I always think about beautiful anastomosing river systems that are a bit of an idea of and a bit of an analogy as to what's gone on, what's happening here at Dugald with, we've got the boundary of these shears pretty well, but in between that, depending on what the fluid flow is doing, we can have various changes as we move through there. And again, some of the wonderful work that Peter's done. So this is just a bit more of a advertisement for Peter's PhD work. And we're working on ways at the moment to apply some of the thinking and some of the theories and some of the results that he came up with and his team came up with to try and use it as more of a predictive tool to try and better understand what's going to happen to the deposit as we move to the south and the north. Here's just some of the in-mine drilling, really nice little rocks that I just wanted to show. This picture here, I think, is quite spectacular. So here we've got little stylolites that run at a 45-degree angle sort of to the ore body. We've got the little teeth coming out of that, and then beautiful carbonate that's popping off the end of those stylolites. So we know we've got this compressive nature that we see in through here. There's actually a stylolite band that actually runs through some ore and some slate that's separating the two. So there's this, compressive component there. And then there's these beautiful boudinage features that we often see in the limestones and other places in the ore body. More of these features and some really nice offsetting faulted structures that are quite common to observe all through the ore body. Here's some again where we've got these very discrete contacts between one type of slate, and then here we've got some slate and some limestone, and across that boundary we can see the limestone's actually been folded a little bit. And in there we've actually got deposition of sulfide. Here's a beautiful boudin where we've got these contrasting layers and then sulfide deposition in these extensional zones. And here's another layer where we've got a pre-existing sulfides, a little bit of sphalerite and a little bit of pyrrhotite within these slate layer. And then right up the middle is a little offset zone, which is full of high-grade sphalerite. So we know we've got a few little things going on here. Let's move through what we've got. No. Well, we've got some technical issues. All right. Just one moment, everyone. I'm just going to plug in my PC. Don't mind me, chat amongst yourselves. No, we're good. We're good, Laurie. Don't you worry. All right, let's carry on. So once we've got all those beautiful textures, here's some of the ore textures that we actually see. So over here is part of the semi-banded ore textures that we often see in the north part of the mine, which start to transition slowly into these areas where we start to see slate clasts that are actually cut off. They're not continuous all the way through there. They're starting to work around like this with a matrix of sphalerite. Then we move through to the what we call the Dugald lode slaty breccia, which is the brecciated unit, which is one of the main mined units, which has got rotated clasts of slate all the way through there with a little bit of pyrrhotite, but mostly just a matrix of high-grade sphalerite. Then we move through to the really significant components of the ore body, which are the massive sulfide sections, where here we can see a nicely rounded clast of fluorite. There's a carbonate clast that's rounded. This is all massive sphalerite, fine-grade massive sphalerite, with small clasts of slate, some little pyrite grains, sometimes cubic pyrite, but otherwise, you know, a sample like that would run somewhere around 30% zinc. They're quite lovely. And again, some other variations of various different ore textures that we see. We can see many different types. And here's one that will really interest a colleague, Renji Zhu, who will hopefully be doing some work on the carbonates and the ore body interactions here. Here we can see a carbonate that's flushed through and actually brecciated some of the pre-existing high-grade zinc mineralization. There's some more banded ore, lots of different styles of textures, very interesting stuff. So part of the original story with Dugald is that we moved through from this, the original SEDEX, the SEDEX idea that we sort of originally had, which is one where we've got these, you know, interbedded layers of sphalerite, of massive sulfide in between all of the slate layers. That's fine in the north zone. As we move to the south, though, here's an example. Here's a beautiful example of some of the massive ore. Here's a beautiful quartz crystal that looks like we're looking down the C-axis. So it's had its time to grow. It's been broken up. Here we go. So there's obviously some later fluids that have been moving through this particular area. Here we've got some pre-existing slate that's been fractured and faulted with pyrite and pyrrhotite, and then it's been cross-cut by a sphalerite, large massive sphalerite across those layers. So there may well have been a SEDEX deposit here initially. It may well have been, maybe it was zinc rich, maybe it wasn't, but there's evidence to show that there's been definite later events that have occurred over time that have brought in and upgraded the deposit. And part of the theory with this is that these particular features, as you can read in Peter's paper, is a Dyriw texture, which is a milling and basically a tectonic upgrading of the sulfides. But I'll leave that to you to read and then come to your own conclusions. So here's some more beautiful rocks here where we've got pyrrhotite, pyrite, very discrete layer in between the two, and then infills within that boudin of high-grade sphalerite. Some very discrete layers here. And I put this image in, and this is for anyone who's doing any exploration in the area or thinking about doing any exploration in any of the areas in the Northwest Minerals Province, especially in the Eastern Inlier. This bit of slate at the bottom in the middle where the scribe is, if you were to drill that, you would be returning 0 zinc, maybe 100 ppm, maybe 150 ppm. And just across that boundary, that's going to come in at plus 10% zinc. There is no way, if you were to drill this, you would ever know if it was an outcropping, but just over there, you're going to have a high-grade zinc deposit. And this occurs in numerous areas of the mine. So it's one to just bear in mind when people are throwing in exploration holes to start with. You've really got to understand that some of these can be quite discrete in these structurally controlled zones. And this was a bit of here's an interactive. Has anyone ever worked at Cannington? Okay, that's good. So this is not going to work. So one of these is Cannington. For Cannington, we know is a big silver deposit, but it's got a little bit of lead around the side. And one of these is from Dugald. So here's an example of some of the rocks that we see and some of the textures that we see in some of the mineralization across the Eastern Inlier. This is probably almost the sort of two extreme versions or extreme areas across the Eastern Inlier, and the textures are phenomenally similar. So there's obviously processes that are going on at Cannington that have produced some of Cannington that has done the same at Dugald. So an interesting little conundrum that we're currently working on here as well. We've also got these near-miss carbonates where we've got massive amounts of carbonate with rotated slates, which are part of these near-miss indicators, which we're chasing down at the moment, which are really interesting and something that we've got some exploration work to and some research work to understand. We want to know if there's a difference between the carbonates that are these near-miss carbonates that don't have no mineralization associated with them, as opposed to the others that look like there's been some carbonate replacement. We're also building our little targeting toolkit. As I said before, these beautiful boudinage layers. Here we've got a cross-cutting chalcopyrite vein that's cross-cut some of the slates. And here we've got these metasomatic features. So we know that there's a later chalcopyrite component that's come through at Dugald. Here's a little tension vein array. This is a beautiful little example of a tension vein array. One of the beautiful things about that in this sort of, rather than being in a semi sort of compressive state, is that in the middle of that tension vein array is sulfide, zinc and pyrite, or sphalerite and pyrrhotite, sphalerite and pyrrhotite in the cores of that tension vein array. So there's some significant associations with the extension and the deposition of zinc in this particular area. So that leads me to, and I'll try to be as fast as possible, some of the research collaborations that we've got going on at the moment to try and understand the drilling that we've been doing, some of the surface drilling and some of the big questions that we've got for the deposit, because they keep building and building. So the first one is our garnet field vectoring study, which is for anyone who potentially worked with the GSQ over the last few years. Matt Valetich, who was principal geologist at GSQ, and then moved on to Anglo, an ex-colleague of mine and a good friend, passed away earlier this year. So we've made sure he was actually the one that originally gave me the heads up around this particular study that was going on, understanding garnets in the Northwest Minerals province. So termed it the Valetich project, having a look at the garnet component that we see in our footwall to try and work out if there's any sort of field vector towards mineralization. We've got another fantastic PhD project with Michelle at Macquarie, with Nathan Dasco and Elena from the GSQ, which is going on at the moment. Obviously, a lot of work that's been going on that Corey really instigated with the GSQ on high logger and understanding these. And as I said before, an interesting carbonate investigation of the deposit to understand a little bit more about the carbonates, which there's not really that much information on, to be honest. Here's some beautiful garnets that we've seen only in the footwall, never in the hanging wall. There's a lot to be gleaned with them. There's some great work that's going to be coming out into the future. So if anyone loves garnets and wants to chat garnets, please feel free to do so. Here's some really nice SEM images where we know there's inclusions of sphalerite and other material in certain components of these garnets. Core to rim, they vary quite a lot, which is super interesting. Some of the petrology work that's been done to understand the timing of mineralization and the association with the host rocks, and some really cool little use of some technology there from our PhD student, Michelle. And some other work that's been done with other workers around the place, people like Richard Lilly, Dr. Richard Lilly, who's a person who'd worked in this place for quite some time and has been putting together some really interesting observations and details for us. And then lastly, I just wanted to pop in this out a little bit. We know that copper in this particular area has been mined, explored for at least the last 100 years or so. And here's some examples for anyone who's seen any Mount Isa style mineralization, any copper mineralization. You might see some similarities there and there. And then also here's a beautiful domino boudin quartz vein that in these little extensional zones, we've got chlorite and chalcopyrite forming. So there's also a structural component to the copper mineralization here, and using these particular microtextures, we're trying to use those as a vector towards where there may be a source of this particular material. So that's an ongoing project that hopefully I'll be able to elucidate on at some later date. So we've got ongoing surface drilling at the moment, as well as all of our underground drilling. It's been great to work in a super complicated deposit. It's been great to be able to collaborate with many different people. And I really encourage anyone, whether you are a researcher who's looking for projects, please do approach and get into the process of approaching companies. It's as long as you come in with a pretty set sort of plan. You know, there's definite interest out there. I was at a workshop not 3 months ago or so, and the interest in trying to utilize the knowledge and skills, especially at Queensland universities, is one that really shouldn't be missed. So I really encourage anyone who's trying to find these projects to approach companies and approach geologists, get their names and and put forward your projects, because there's definite opportunities there, because the amount of drill core and other things that are available through a lot of these companies is quite something. So anyway, this is a rail rocket through a very favorite deposit of mine. So I really appreciate everyone's time, and open to any questions.
So if anyone wants to questions, I've got to give them this so that their voice can be recorded.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you for your presentation. It was a great presentation. Covered some really early stage concepts, well presented. Question. So this, the indicators for this project are on surface and are relatively obvious, but complex underneath.
Yep.
30, 50 meters below cover. How do you find it?
It's such a good question, and it's one that, especially for any geologist who starts on our team, or anyone that we've had moving through, it's often a question that or not a question, but a idea that we like to put forward, because yes, if it was under 50 meters of cover, it would be a supreme challenge to try and pinpoint it. Geophysics, the geophysics component of this deposit is one that is complicated, because there is so much in any of these slates. There's always a lot of sulfide, a lot of pyrrhotite, and which is supremely magnetic. So any magnetics will pick up pyrrhotite that's in there, but that doesn't necessarily tell you that there's any sphalerite around. And we've had numerous instances of targeting some magnetic targets which look akin to the Dugald deposit, and you drill in there, it's no worries, there's heaps of pyrrhotite. And there's also the same kinematic indicators that you're in this, and that's the Mosing sheared zone, but no sphalerite. No, nothing at all. So it's a great challenge, and it's one that this garnet study. So what we've often found at Dugald is that the garnets in the hanging wall are very closely associated with the drilling that we've done with the extreme hanging wall of the deposit at the footwall of the deposit, right up against the ore zone. So it's a project that I know that out at Cannington, there's been a lot of work on the garnets at Broken Hill for many years. Steve Walters had been looking at garnets and garnet chemistry, and it's something that, this particular mineral may be something that we may be able to use, as it's weathered, resistate. You might be able to find it using stream sediments to at least help you understand whether you're close or not. So we're trying to work out whether there's something to do with the chemistry of the garnets that might help as a bit of a vector, because it's a great question. And even, so I was just speaking to Simon before, and talking about areas that, trying to look for an area that might look like Dugald, and then using whatever techniques to look at other areas that might look interesting. And then someone, there might be someone that says, oh, that's been drilled though. And that's the biggest one for me that says, oh, cool, that's still open then. Because you just drill, if you happen to drill in any of these pinching and swelling zones, you could drill and just serendipitously drill one hole 100 meters along, drill another hole, you hit a little bit of slate with a little bit of mineralization, hardly any sphalerite. And then you heard another one, same thing. But in between that, it'll have blown out and swelled out, and to have some high grade ore, or you don't quite understand the geometry in it. Even the deposit over a sort of a 1.5 kilometer strike is quite steeply dipping, and then all of a sudden it'll just sort of relax out. That'd be a better area to try and hit, but how do you know that it's there? You might hit these other areas and just drill slate with nothing else associated, but just there you've got ore. And it's also one of the challenges with mining, because the wastes, unlike a big porphyry deposit, which has a nice, huge alteration halo that's associated with mineralization, whilst there is alteration at Dugald, it doesn't help. The zinc is super confined. So, yeah, but it is a good question.
Thanks, Nick. That was fascinating. Just on the alteration halo thing, I think Dugald River's got an enormous copper alteration halo around the whole thing. And if you look at the Roseby copper deposits plus Little Evie, you've got about, 250, 300 million tonnes at 0.6 copper in a belt around it. How do you think that do you think that's related to the Dugald system? And do you think it ties in at all?
It's That's also a really great question, and one that I've been pondering for at least 3 years. And I know Corey and I had pondered for many years to think about that, because, yeah, it is. It's one of those fascinating things that just a kilometre north, you've got Little Eva, this huge deposit, which in itself, that deposit has got satellite copper deposits around it. And as I said, if you jump onto GeoRes Globe, anyone who's interested, because it's a good resource to use, and you open up all of the deposits, you'll just see Little Eva, Dugald, and then copper, 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 copper everywhere. So Dugald, in fact, and this is something that I usually like to say, but it's almost like an anomaly within the anomaly. You've got this zinc lead silver deposit in amongst copper deposits everywhere. There's many, many more historic copper deposits and copper prospects than there are zinc lead silver prospects. So it's a real weird one, and one that the hanging wall copper, which has again been something that's been chased for quite some time. Dr. Richard Lilly, when he was working out in that area for many, many years, they were chasing the copper deposits themselves and trying to understand if there's anything bigger at depth. And I don't think they came to any final conclusion. And it's one that we've got malachite that just pops around in all these little outcrops along our hanging wall. And you think, oh, I wonder if it is related. It's something that we're chasing down, and hopefully next time I'll be able to give you an answer. I hope. But looking at all of the big thing with the copper here as well is that there's almost a couple of different styles. There's definite massive veins that come through and cross-cut the foliation, so they look like a much later vein. There's others that are sitting in the hinges of slate, so where the slate looks like it's been folded, sitting in the hinges. And then there's other material that almost looks like Mount Isa, where you've got silica dolomite and copper associated with that. So I wish I had an answer, but it excites me, but I don't know.
Look, I jumped in and stole the microphone. Further along strike, you mentioned you've got a lot of pyrrhotite. Do you have anywhere where there's massive pyrrhotite with I'm going to say it wrong, Dyriw textures?
So good, isn't it?
Do you have anywhere where it's just pyrrhotite without the lead and zinc, and then suddenly it turns into lead and zinc?
I don't know.
Dyriw, but
The vegan.
because the example would be, elsewhere in the area, there's several prospects that have got massive pyrrhotite veins with exactly the same textures, but it doesn't have the lead and zinc. So should we go and look along strike from them for the lead and zinc?
I would, but the problem, I think probably the biggest misconception or the biggest challenge that we've got is that considering, we always think about these, I've spoken to a lot of people who've worked on Dugald maybe in the past, or there's just been general conversations. And the first thing is, I remember telling an old colleague, I'm going to work at Dugald, and he goes, oh, that's that little SEDEX thing. And so I thought, oh, okay, it's a little SEDEX thing. And off I went, packed my bags and went up and had a chat with Corey. And he said, nah, not quite so much. So the idea that you can just go along strike and actually pick those things up is not, I don't think that's necessarily the right approach. It's to try and understand the structures themselves. And then there was a picture that I showed up before, which has got massive pyrrhotite. And then just down from that, there's actually a Boudin feature with massive sphalerite in between. So the question is, do you have this pre-existing vegan texture where things have been milled and broken up, and then you've got a later fluid that's actually moved through on one of the many different deformation events, could be D2, 2.1, or could be D3, could be D4, that's actually moved this fluid and remobilized the zinc, or it's come from another system. Maybe something like the big copper system, you might have a big zone refining system where you've got a larger source at depth that then zone refines out with temperature. But I don't think I could give you a solid answer for that, because I think it's far more complicated. I think
no, that's fair enough, but not an easy one.
No, but it's cool though. It's a good problem to have, because it's one of those things where you look at all of the ingredients that you need to have to produce one of those deposits, and that says, cool, we've got a lot of sulfur. You've got a breccia. You've had things moving around. Happy days. You've got slates and contrasting slates. It's good. So if you are doing that, don't give up. Keep trying.
Oh, there you go.
Nick, those garnets,
Yes,
what sort of garnets are they?
mostly spessartine.
Which is Broken Hill garnets?
Yeah. Well, there are manganese.
Most of the Broken Hill garnets are spessartite.
So what we're trying to work out, obviously they're much smaller than what you end up getting at Broken Hill. But
If you did a geochem survey on all your stuff, is there a manganese anomaly associated with the ore bodies? or
So
what?
I probably should have said that. Yeah, there's a huge manganese anomaly associated with the ore body. So the slates themselves, manganese rich. So one of the big processing problems is the amount of manganese that can come up with.
And when you go along the different ore zones, do they show, are they more or less continuous? I know you got your boudinages and all that, but are they more or less continuous? Or do they show fattening against some particular fault? Cross fault perhaps? It doesn't have to be a cross fault.
It's a good question, and it's one that yes, in a sense, yes, it does, where because there's not any there's no singular fault which shows that, but there are definitely some interactions between steeply west dipping faults in general and some shallow west dipping faults, that during that interaction in those little extension zones, that's where we find a lot of the increased or the larger
With
ore zones.
your section there, what does the copper part look like in section? Now, it looked to me like it was sort of stratigraphic. But if it was like Mount Isa, it fattens against a great big fault. And such a fault is where all the goodies come from.
Yep.
And as you go away from it, they will thin. If you get a smell of fattening, I talked to Ian Johnson once about this years ago at Dugald, and I got the impression that as you went deeper in my primitive version of the ore body, and it's the same on your picture, it's a smaller straight like that. But Ian told me on the back of a serviette one day in a pub that went down and it did something like that.
Yeah, definitely changing. And the question around copper is a great one, and it's something that we've actually been chasing. One of the problems that we've had, which is always a problem with, I guess, and maybe other people have the same experience, but because a lot of the focus at one point was just making sure that the drilling underground was just drilled through and make sure once you've hit the ore zone, after you've gone through the ore zone, stop, sample, and see you later. And the focus was not necessarily on copper. So some of the extensions of the drilling through the hanging wall to make sure that we've actually got a reasonable representation of what that hanging wall copper looks like is not quite there. So we're trying to build that at the moment. So trying to get this continuous sort of view has been quite difficult, understanding that we've got this anastomosing system. But I completely take your point, and it's something that we've been.
I think with the cost, Mount Isa, there's two sorts of copper. The Stratform silver lead zinc deposit have a little bit of copper, but not much. Hilton, a bit more.
We might have to have a chat.
Copper deposits don't have any lead zinc. They have the grey in copper.
Yeah, okay. So that's what we'll have to look for. All right.
Okay, we might.
Love it.
Keep on.
Thanks, Russ. Perfect.
Right, here we go, Nick.
Righto, Simon. Let's go.
Okay, first, you talk about footwall sequence, carbonates. Can you give it just a bit more definition on what those carbonates actually are? And you mentioned limestones. Is it dolomite or is it dolomitized limestone or whatever? Secondly, answering somebody's question about how to find one of these, the point about the Mary Kathleen Fold Belt is there's not much cover. It's crappy outcrop, but it is outcrop. So years ago, we characterized using Landsat data Dugald River as a certain color anomaly, and there's about 3 other points along the Corella that have exactly the same color. Not always been drilled. So that's another. There's your try satellite imagery and processing that, looking for presumably alteration. And any evidence of carbonate replacement. Some of those textures I was seeing suggested to me carbonate replacement. And the point I'll make about the sediment hosted, I mean, I don't call them SEDEX, the sediment hosted, or as the Americans now call it, clastic dominant. They've lost the SEDEX. They've given up on that. Yep. Those rocks generally, I don't know, how do I put this? got a lot more carbonate in them than would be assumed, and also carbonate footwall rocks is characteristic of every lead zinc deposit in the Western world. So that would suggest that maybe SEDEX is
Possibly.
that's the
There's-
best bit of evidence for that sediment hosting.
Yeah. So the limestone varies quite a lot. The makeup of the entire suite, we don't know. And we haven't done enough investigation in. That's why we've got one project at the moment to actually understand the carbonates a little bit better. There's dolomite in, so the argillaceous limestone, full of it's just full of quartz and mica. And a lot of feldspar. There is a dolomitic component. There's dolomite definitely in there, but the extent of that and exactly which particular layers it's in within that limestone, don't know. And it's something that we're trying to work on, because where I showed a near miss indicator, one of these large carbonate breccias, which there is definite evidence that there is some carbonate replacement textures for sure, and a lot of some carbonate replacement textures with the copper as well. What type of carbonate that actually is, what the geochemistry of that carbonate is, I'm quite interested in trying to understand. And something that Renji Zhu from UQ is also very much interested in as well. Is there a particular type of carbonate? Because that near miss indicator that looks like a beautifully ground prepped area for that, that's very close to the ore body, and there is no zinc in it. So it's wondering, is it a much later carbonate? You know, we've got within the limestone, there are carbonate veins, large carbonate veins that cut through the limestone. So there's multiple different generations of carbonate. There's some carbonate that's cut other carbonate that has chalcopyrite in it. So there's the carbonate story, and I take your point 100% because I think it's a good one. The carbonate story is one that's going to be interesting.
Can I just add that
Yes.
the extra thing is that certain places like Walford Creek, manganese is the key definer of the carbonate that's been replaced by pyrite. So you now, and then you metamorphose that, and you've got your specificity. So
Okay.
I don't know, just a thought.
I like that thought. Thanks, Simon. Take that one away with me.
That's okay. So have you tried to come up with different sedimentary environments and the geometry of the different sedimentary features that are competent versus incompetent, and how that controls your structural deformation, which would then lead to the patterns of shearing and then mineralization?
A really short basic answer, no. There's obviously, I mean, there's been a wealth of work, and there's probably stuff that has been done that's been, I mean, with the amount of years and the amount of work that's been done on this deposit, almost for sure. I haven't come across personally any yet. But it's something with our PhD student, Michelle, one of the things we're trying to work out, one of the things I want to know is, are there the variations within the slate units themselves? Is there something specifically about that gives rise to producing these particular features? Absolutely. And those changes in bedding? Absolutely. Because then, I mean, the other big question is then about the Knapdale quartzite. We sort of talk about it as the quartzite, but there is variation east and west across that whole thing, because we don't see the ripples everywhere. They don't continue everywhere. Where we drilled, there's some areas that we've drilled along that eastern edge, which are very, very different to what you see up on the outcrop part of that quartzite. And then there's some interpretation that it's part of a big thrusted unit, that it's something from elsewhere. So there's a component of that quartzite that may not be actually connected at all to the quartzite. So that whole story is one that is not completely understood, for sure. So we've got cross bedding in some of the drill core that we've drilled recently. So you see beautiful cross beds, wonderful. So yeah, there's a bigger sedimentary story there too, for sure.
Okay, I'll just get one more question now, I think, and then we better.
It's time for beer.
You didn't really say much about the galena in the ore body. From what I've seen of the Mount Isa ore, the undisturbed or least deformed ore bodies in the lead zinc area of well-banded, discrete bands of galena. When you start to deform it, it moves like liquid, and it moves to the fold axes, it moves into fractures and veins. in a deposit like Dugald River, which is higher metamorphic grade and far more deformed, I would expect it to be very mobile, and I would expect the sphalerite to be moderately mobile. And most of what you're seeing are post-depositional effects, and the presence of banded ore suggests that they're the least deformed bits, and that's where you're probably looking for the original origin of most of the sulfides.
Yeah. Yep, point taken.